Back to Iraq? The U.S. pledges support for the Iraqi government as insurgents gain momentum. Pope Francis meets with the president of the Dominican Republic and speaks candidly with a Spanish newspaper.
I'm Mark Irons here at a corner in New Orleans where faith and the party culture collide. I'll have that story for you tonight.
And I'm Alan Holdren in Orvieto, Italy, where they're celebrating the 750th anniversary of the Eucharistic miracle.
Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Friday, June 13th, 2014. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with our EWTN News Nightly team around the world. As we look at news now, it's been less than 3 years since most American forces have left Iraq, and tonight, President Barack Obama is considering short-term military options to help stem insurgent violence there. Now, many Iraqis are fleeing north as al-Qaeda-inspired militants threaten to attack Baghdad. Wyatt Goolsby reports tonight from the Iraqi Embassy here in Washington.
Brian, Iraqi officials, including the ambassador here, are saying they need additional help from the U.S. on all fronts. But how exactly the U.S. is going to help is still being worked out. As we learned today, a more concrete plan will likely come soon.
It's a scary sight to many Iraqis and Americans. This mobile phone video appears to show militants staging a parade through Mosul in military vehicles. Some of them fired guns shouting towards Baghdad. The United States is carefully watching the spike in violence this week. Today, the president said he and his security team will send additional help, but he would not put more American troops on the ground.
So this should be a wake-up call. Iraq's leaders have to demonstrate a willingness to make hard decisions and compromises on behalf of the Iraqi people in order to bring the country together. In that effort, they will have the support of the United States and our friends and our allies.
Meanwhile, more jammed border crossings into Kurdistan. The United Nations Refugee Agency says that Iraq's refugee population has reached 800,000. Experts say much of the Christian community in Mosul and other northern cities have already fled. Several reports from the city say at least 2 churches were torched by the jihadists. Those militants are known for killing Christians who do not submit to their extreme Islamist vision.
Many of the people who've sought safety in the Erbil and Duhok governorates arrived with little more than the clothes they were wearing. Many have no money, nowhere to go. Some stay with relatives. Others are at present staying in hotels, risking depletion of what funds they've brought with them.
A former Iraqi vice president who fled the country to avoid arrest says Iraqis can and will stand up for their country. He says most of the problems are political.
We should try our best to defuse the bomb. And before we enter into a possible civil war, and I don't know the contingency, the consequences of that, if Noor al-Maliki is still in power. So the international community could assist us to defuse the bomb, to mitigate the tension.
Islamic Shia clerics also urged Iraqis today during the Friday prayers to join the security forces in the fight against the militants. In the meantime, the Iraqi government is preparing the capital and tightening security in preparation for the fighting. Brian?
All right, thank you, Wyatt. And as Iraq's widening insurgency fuels concerns, the price of oil continued climbing today, nearing $107 a barrel, a 10-month high. Despite the turmoil in Iraq, President Obama said there has been no disruption of oil supplies from the country. The violence in Iraq is mostly centered in the country's north, away from major oil-producing regions of the south. The turmoil hasn't yet had a big effect on oil exports. It is raising concerns, though, about Iraq's ability to rebuild its oil infrastructure and meet world demand. Now, some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl is back on American soil tonight. 2 weeks after gaining his freedom in a Taliban prisoner exchange, Bergdahl is now at Army Post in Texas. He was transferred from a military treatment facility in Germany to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio. An Army spokesman says Bergdahl will continue the next phase of his reintegration process, but there's no timeline for that process. John McCormack, senior writer for the Weekly Standard, joins us. What's next for Bergdahl, John?
He'll be at this medical facility in San Antonio going undergoing further evaluations. There will be some question as to whether or not he could potentially end up facing a court-martial for the allegations that he may have deserted when he was in Afghanistan. I think once these psychological evaluations are complete, we'll have a better idea as to whether or not that's an option that people might want to consider or not.
And the bigger story tonight really is Iraq, and the president saying we'll support the Iraqi government, no troops. So what are the other options?
No troops on the ground. I would say that the biggest option potentially is airstrikes. Now, there is some problem that we may have already dithered too long. The time to do airstrikes is when the insurgents are on the highway going down the road in a convoy, as they were reported to have done. Once they begin to occupy a city, it's going to be much, much more difficult to get them out of there without street fighting, which is going to have to be undertaken by the Shia militias and the Iraqi army, which had basically melted away.
Yeah, that's an important clarification. He said no troops on the ground, so airstrike's a possibility. Do you think the violence in Iraq is a result of the drawdown by America?
Certainly. I think that it is a totally valid criticism that had we left 10,000 troops in there, which is what the president himself had proposed to do at one point and what Mitt Romney had said he wished had happened, that didn't happen because the status of forces agreement fell through with the Iraqi government. Some people blame the White House for disengagement during that time, letting those negotiations fall through. But I think if there were 10,000 American troops in there, there is no way that an al-Qaeda-inspired terrorist organization would be marching down the road right now.
While we have you here, I want to talk about this big shakeup on Capitol Hill. Eric Cantor out as House Majority Leader. So what does this mean for the Republican Party, and why do you think he lost that primary to Dave Bratt?
I think it definitely has to do with the ongoing talks about whether or not there will be comprehensive immigration reform. The party has gone back and forth about whether this will come up for a vote. Eric Cantor, as a majority leader, is the one who is able to schedule a vote. So you had talk radio hosts like Mark Levin, Laura Ingraham going into that district and having these big rallies. You know, this really wasn't covered by a lot of people. It shocked a lot of people, but it was these talk radio hosts and the Tea Party at the local level, grassroots level, weren't really happy with Eric Cantor, thought he might have spent too much time in Washington, but if it weren't for this immigration issue, he definitely would have lost. He lost 8,000 votes between 2012 and 2014, and you just can't do that and go on to win.
Is the Tea Party feeling legitimized right now?
They're
because
feeling
of this?
great.
Yeah.
They've had so many stories about, oh, the Tea Party is dead because they lost a race against, the Senate, Senator McConnell in Kentucky. They lost a couple other races. But clearly there's always going to be a conservative, insurgent, populist movement within the Republican Party, and they won one this time.
Yeah, it's important to point out that Dave Bratt hasn't won a seat yet. He just won the primary.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, John, thanks for joining us. We look forward to having you back.
Thanks for having me.
Well, there is still no lead or strong lead tonight after two priests were attacked in their church rectory in downtown Phoenix Wednesday night. One priest died and another was critically injured. Police gave a limited description of the suspect, a white man in his 40s. That's all they have. Police say there may be more than one suspect, and they're offering a $1,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. In Louisiana, Governor Bobby Jindal has signed two pro-life bills into law. House Bill 305 says abortion providers can't teach or provide education materials in public schools. The other bill, the Unsafe Abortion Protection Act, requires doctors performing abortions to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital. The bill was authored by Democrat Katrina Jackson. Louisiana Right to Life Executive Director Ben Clapper, shown here, told EWTN News Nightly, the bill's passage is proof that pro-life values are a Louisiana value, not a partisan one, at least in that state. Well, acclaimed actress and civil rights activist Ruby Dee has died. Her career spans stage, radio, television, and film. She's best known for her role in A Raisin in the Sun, and age never slowed her down. Dee received an Oscar nomination at age 83 for the role she played in American Gangster. She became the first African-American woman to play lead roles at the American Shakespeare Festival. Dee often acted alongside her husband, Ossie Davis. She died at age 91. Well, Thailand's military government just announced that it has fully lifted a nationwide curfew it imposed after seizing power in Thailand last month. The government says there's no threat of violence, and it's time to encourage tourism. Foreigners agree that a midnight curfew puts a damper on their visits.
It's brilliant because, say for like last night, we wanted to see the World Cup match, but we couldn't, because it's on at 2 a.m.
For 6 months before the May 22nd coup, Bangkok had been the scene of anti-government protests and political turmoil. Well, today Pope Francis received Danilo Sanchez, president of the Dominican Republic, at the Vatican. Sanchez thanked the Pope for the Church's social contributions to his country, especially in fields of education and healthcare. He presented Francis with gifts, including a rosary made from regional semi-precious stones. Also, in an interview with a Spanish newspaper, Pope Francis discussed Christianity's Jewish roots, Middle East peace, and his concern for Christians in the Holy Land. He also defended Pope Pius XII and called him a great defender of Jews during World War II. The interview's full translation is on Catholic News Agency's website. Of course, CNA is an EWTN news partner. The Pope also said he promised Brazilians he would try to remain neutral during the World Cup. However, Brazilians weren't exactly neutral themselves after beating Croatia 3-1 last night. Fans across the country were ecstatic with the early victory. They cheered, and in typical Latin style, they danced. It was an equally festive celebration in Salvador, Brazil, where a victory parade made its way through the streets. Even people in remote cattle ranches on the edge of the Amazon tuned in for the match. Brazil takes on Mexico next, but first, today's matches: Mexico and Cameroon, Spain and the Netherlands, Chile and Australia. Now, I've got to give credit to our audio and lighting engineer, Leon Seegers, for this one. From redirecting cars to dancing with the stars. New Jersey Governor Christie busted a move in a segment called The Evolution of Dad Dancing on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon last night. He later joked that his dancing was more humiliating to his family than the bridge scandal that has tarnished his national reputation. I'd agree with that. Christie was considered a top White House contender before news broke that traffic on the George Washington Bridge was redirected in an apparent act of political retribution. Members of his administration were later implicated in the scandal, and if I were him, I wouldn't quit my day job. Coming up, we take you to a medieval Italian town, the site of a famous Eucharistic miracle. And is a demographic disaster looming for the U.S.? We talk with an expert about disturbing new numbers. On Friday, June 13th, the feast of St. Anthony. I'm Brian Patrick, and this is EWTN News Nightly. Thanks for joining us. This weekend, folks in a quaint Italian town are celebrating a miracle that happened nearly 800 years ago. The hilltop city of Orvieto is in many ways a classic example of the beauty of Italy. It's also a classic example of the beauty of the church. Amid the quaint streets and medieval feel of the old town is this imposing cathedral, where locals are marking the end of a 2-year jubilee for the Eucharist.
We last year have celebrated the Jubilee event for the conclusion of 750 years of the Eucharistic miracle of Bolsena, and this year we're still continuing a second Jubilee year for the celebration of the Feast of Corpus Domini for the whole church.
From the small corner of Italy, where the locals are preparing to remember both in a special way this weekend. Well, our Alan Holdren is in Orvieto. Alan, what's the celebration about there?
Brian, we're just inside the Cathedral of Orvieto, Italy, where proof of that Eucharistic miracle is kept. And I'm here with Carlo Munz. Carlo, nice to be here with you. You're an expert on the holy sites of Italy and also the Holy Land. What can you tell us about this Eucharistic miracle?
Actually, in that year, a German priest named Peter of Praga was traveling back to Germany after visiting Rome on a pilgrimage. And he had the Mass in Bolsena, not far from here, in the Church of Santa Cristina. And while it was consecrated, the host, blood sprayed from the host itself and covered the corporale, which was on the altar itself. And he was astonished, and he went suddenly to the Pope, which was residing here in Orvieto at the time, Urban IV. And the Pope sent some people to check about this and found that it was a real miracle underwent in that church. So they brought here the corporale while they left other relics in the church. And from that moment, two years later, I think, the Pope, face of this wonderful miracle, instituted with a bull the holiday or the feast of the Corpus Domini.
And can I ask you, how is this Jubilee being celebrated 750 years later, this weekend in particular?
Well, this has been celebrated and is going on until this year with a special liturgy where the Eucharisty is at the center of the attention to the devotion of the pilgrims and people, visitors here. And also there's a special indulgence. There is a door, a special door, like in the Jubilees, the normal Jubilees. Everyone who passes through that door can have this special indulgence.
And this weekend, what will you be doing this
Well, actually, here is also some cultural activities which are linked to this miracle. One is a special theatrical show here just in front of the church, which remind this wonderful miracle, and also other medieval shows which link the people to the times.
Truly a special event. Thank you so much for being with us, Carlo.
Yes.
And back to you in Washington, D.C. there, Brian.
All right, thank you, Alan and Carlo. And back here in the U.S., a recent report reveals historically low fertility rates in America. This comes from the National Center for Health Statistics. In 2013, there were 62.9 births for every 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 44. This was a slight drop from 2012, with 63 births for every 1,000 women. The study also reveals a decline in the total fertility rate, dropping from 1.88 in 2012 to 1.87 in 2013. It may not seem like a lot, but this is a record low and a level that is below replacement, the number needed for a generation to replicate itself. We're happy to welcome back Jonathan Last, author of What to Expect When No One's Expecting. Those numbers don't seem so shocking. Is that 100th? Is that significant when we're talking about fertility?
No, the numbers, people get hung up on the numbers. The actual numbers are less important than the overall direction of the trend. And what's important here is that the direction of the trend for the last 6 or 7 years has been downward. We'd seen declining fertility in America since about 1970 or so. It bumped up a little bit in the early 2000s, largely because of Hispanic immigration. But now that's been settling and back and slipping away again.
Is there any indication that trend will change?
Probably not. What we see here really two trends layered on top of one another. The first trend is that big sort of cultural trend dating back to about 1968 when people started having fewer and fewer kids. We've been below replacement in America really since 1973. But then more recently we have the big Great Recession, which is sort of tamped down. We have more economic uncertainty, declining wages within the household, high unemployment, and that's been layered on top, sort of further pushing down people's near-term decisions about kids.
I was raised in a very poor family. We had 10 kids. So is economics the only factor here, or what are the other reasons why people aren't having kids?
No, not the only factor, but we think a big factor, especially again in this near term, the last 5 or 6 years, because again, so much is wrapped up in uncertainty. It's not just the wages, but again, people don't know if they're still going to have a job in another 18 months. But overall, we've seen the real collapse of the marriage culture. That's one of the big undercover drivers of all this, right? Divorce is up largely from what it was in 1960. Now 1 of every 2 marriages fails. Cohabitation happens. People start living together, and those cohabitations then break up pretty quickly. And so as sort of the marriage culture gets attacked, one of the big fallouts from that is people stop having kids, and they have fewer kids than they otherwise would have if they were staying in intact marriages.
And that makes sense. If you have an intact marriage, the family is much more secure. What other consequences have we seen here in America as a result of this trend?
Well, the big one is that the general age of the population keeps going upward, right? We are going to the point where by 2035, the average age in America is going to be what the average age in Florida is today. And this presents all sorts of stresses on Social Security, Medicare, among other things, right? It's just sort of basic math. You need more workers to support retirees. And when those ratios get flipped and you have more retirees than you do workers, then it becomes very, very hard to sustain those programs.
Do you have any thought on how we can address this problem as people?
We've got to start addressing it to begin with. I mean, I would say in Europe and in Asia, this is like a big topic of public policy conversation. People are very interested in this. Lots of attempts are being made at trying to get people to have more kids. We're not there yet in America, but I think we're starting to.
What to Expect When No One's Expecting, the book by Jonathan Last. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Up next, U.S. bishops wrap up their spring meeting in New Orleans. We trace the Catholic roots of this city of saints. And shepherds shopping? A unique look at some of the items vendors sell to bishops at their meetings. Thank you so much for joining us on this feast of St. Anthony of Padua. I'm Brian Patrick on EWTN News Nightly, and today we're learning more about a fascinating St. Anthony project. Forensic experts are attempting to reconstruct the face of this Franciscan saint. They're using the latest 3D technology and a digital copy of the saint's skull to create this image. The face will be displayed at the basilica dedicated to St. Anthony in Padua, where his relics are. Well, the bishops have wrapped up their spring meeting in New Orleans. They voted to approve documents about the permanent diaconate, initiatives to protect religious freedom, and a statement to guide Catholic voters. All three items passed unanimously. Besides conducting business, bishops had the chance to explore a city with vibrant history and culture. Our Mark Irons reports from the Big Easy.
Many people come to New Orleans for the entertainment scene, but this city also has a rich faith tradition. I may be on Bourbon Street now, but look over here. I'm at the corner of St. Peter.
Many of the streets are named after saints.
New Orleans is the second oldest archdiocese in the United States. And this week, with over 200 bishops in town, the city is reminded of its deep Catholic roots. And New Orleans Archbishop Gregory Amen couldn't be happier.
It's a real blessing to have so many bishops here. It's another way of calling the attention to the Catholicity in our city.
So you'll still hear the familiar sounds of New Orleans from the French Quarter. But inside the iconic St. Louis Cathedral, you'll hear something that's been around a lot longer. The bishops celebrate Mass, then take to the streets. This winding river of white is a sight to see.
Oh, that's the first time I've been in a place with so many bishops.
It was very surprising that there were that many.
It was cool.
I was actually pleasantly surprised to come upon this scene. We weren't expecting to see any congregation of Catholic bishops, or certainly not a cardinal.
The bishop's presence brings light to New Orleans, a city that has its own areas of darkness.
There are places that we would certainly stay away from. There are places that we would not recommend in terms of morality. At the same time, there are many, many places that we would recommend. The food is delicious, it's wonderful, it's unique. The French Quarter in itself, I think, tells a story of history, it tells a story of faith.
If you see a Catholic bishop here, don't be surprised. Be reminded of the faith upon which this city was built. In New Orleans, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
All right, thank you, Mark, and our Jason Calvi for covering the USCCB spring meeting in New Orleans. So, with the meeting now over, we thought we would flash back to a story we first covered at the Bishops' Conference last fall here in Baltimore. Wyatt Goolsby discovered vendors who see bishops as shoppers.
There's no debating Catholic bishops have a busy schedule, tackling some of the biggest issues in the church today. But outside of the meeting rooms, near the hotel's elevators, you might be surprised to see a lot of advertising. Not ads for you and me, but specialty items aimed at bishops.
By the time most bishops get off the elevator and onto the 5th floor or higher, they're actually ready for bed. But by the time you get up to these hotel rooms, there's a lot more than just beds. If you'll notice, the hallways here are absolutely decked out with all kinds of clerical items for sale, like vests. There's everything from chalices to chasubles over here. And the more you walk around here, the more you notice there's a lot of really high-quality material.
How are you? We followed Bishop Raymond Shapetto from Brooklyn through several shops set up inside the hotel rooms.
We can purchase things that we need for our ministry, especially the bishop's clothing that you can't buy in a regular clothing store.
It's not just clothes, unique wood carvings, gold tabernacles, even a stained glass window of Mother Teresa. Bishop Shapetto even checked in with the company doing some renovation work on a church in his diocese. And while it may seem out of the ordinary to your average hotel visitor, Bishop Shapetto says having the merchants here in a common spot is a big help in planning for the future.
You establish a relationship with the vendors because they're at all the meetings of the bishops, so we come to know them and they come to know us.
Well, some beautiful items. Thank you, Wyatt Goolsby. Before we go tonight, some slightly biased predictions about Monday's World Cup game between Germany and Portugal. Regina, a young octopus at the Sea Life Aquarium in Berlin, made her prediction by opening the lid of one of two boxes installed at a small soccer goal inside her tank. Of course, she picked a box with the German flag, showing remarkable national pride for a sea creature. In Germany's Munster Zoo, an armadillo named Norman rushed towards one of the three small footballs marked with the German flag, also predicting a win for Germany. Maybe Norman is right, since the armadillo is the World Cup mascot. Well, thank you for watching tonight and throughout the week. Until Monday, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and watch again anytime you like on EWTN's YouTube page. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Good night and God bless you.